When Lucas Harding moved into Willow Crest Estates, he wanted nothing more than stability. After a car accident 2 years earlier left him partially paralyzed, his world had become a maze of adjustments, new routines, modified vehicles, endless medical appointments. But through it all, he carried one unwavering goal: to reclaim a sense of independence. The small, single-story home he purchased was meant to be that sanctuary. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and what appeared to be a well-organized homeowners association promised the structure and safety he craved. The wheelchair ramp built onto the front of his home wasn't extravagant. Constructed by certified contractors, it complied with both state accessibility requirements and the community's safety guidelines. It was sturdy, subtle, and designed to blend with the exterior. Lucas had been proud of it not because it looked good, but because it symbolized a victory over a future he once feared he couldn't face alone. For several weeks, peace held. Neighbors waved, kids played nearby, and life settled into a rhythm he had hoped for. But beneath the facade of pleasant suburbia, Willow Crest harbored a governing body that took its aesthetic rules more seriously than its compassion. And within that HOA, a small faction of board members saw themselves less as volunteers and more as gatekeepers of uniformity. It began quietly, always quietly. A man in a reflective vest lingered near Lucas's yard one morning. He claimed he was performing routine visual inspections. A woman with a clipboard paused frequently on the sidewalk, looking between the ramp and her printed guidelines. The HOA newsletter arrived with a sudden emphasis on community cohesion and visible exterior modifications. The messages were coded, subtle, but Lucas felt the tension building like static in the air. 2 weeks later, the first letter appeared in his mailbox. It was folded neatly, printed on HOA letterhead, and carried a tone that attempted professionalism but couldn't mask its condescension. The letter stated that his recent construction did not meet the community's uniform exterior appearance standards. It ordered him to restore the property to its original state within 30 days or face fines. It did not mention accessibility laws. It did not reference his medical condition. It did not offer alternatives or accommodations. It simply demanded removal. Lucas read the letter twice, then a third time. There was no mistake. The HOA was ordering him to tear down the ramp that allowed him to enter and exit his own home. A cold frustration washed over him, sharp, familiar, exhausting. He had dealt with bureaucracy before, with insurance companies and building inspectors who didn't understand disability until forced to. But the idea that his own neighborhood, a place he chose for peace, would fight him over something so essential, it was a sting he hadn't prepared for. He set the letter aside, telling himself it must be a misunderstanding. He gathered paperwork, permits, contractor files, documentation of compliance. He made copies. He organized them in a binder. He visited the HOA office in person, confident the matter could be resolved with simple clarification. But when he arrived, the receptionist avoided eye contact, offering a clipped explanation that the board had already reviewed his ramp and deemed it non-conforming. She declined to elaborate. She refused to schedule a meeting. She repeated, almost robotically, that the decision was final. The following week, a second letter arrived. This one included a fine. The amount was small, at first symbolic. A shot fired across the bow. But Lucas recognized escalation when he saw it. The third letter arrived 2 days later. The fine doubled, then the fourth, then an email threatening legal action if he did not voluntarily remove the unauthorized structure. Lucas's peaceful new life had turned into a siege. Neighbors began noticing the change. Some offered quiet sympathy, a nod on the driveway, an apologetic expression when passing by. But others kept their distance, wary of the board's influence. Rumors circulated that the ramp was hurting property values, that it was too visible, that it changed the look of the street. None of them dared say these things to Lucas directly, but he overheard them whispered while rolling to his mailbox or taking his dog outside. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed every law, every code, every step required. Yet he was being treated like an intruder in a place he thought would finally feel like home. Instead of giving in, he began documenting everything. Every letter. Every fine. Every ignored request for a meeting. The dates. The times. The names of board members involved. Every moment added to a growing file that transformed from frustration into a record of wrongdoing. Still, the HOA pushed harder. One morning, Lucas discovered 2 board members standing at the edge of his driveway, pointing at his ramp and measuring the incline with small metal tools. They spoke to each other with clinical detachment, ignoring him completely even when he rolled onto the porch. Their disregard struck him harder than the threats. They looked at his lifeline as if it were a blemish. And that's when the final letter came. It was the harshest yet, outlining a deadline for removal, escalating fines to daily charges, and warning of lien proceedings should he fail to comply. They were threatening his home, his stability, his independence, but beneath the fear rose something else, something steadier, sharper, and far more enduring: resolve. This was bigger than a ramp. Bigger than fines. Bigger than aesthetics. This was discrimination. Lucas closed the letter with a calm he did not fully feel, but one he had learned to project in moments when strength mattered more than emotion. He opened his laptop. He began researching. Within minutes, he found exactly what he needed: the federal law that protected people like him from exactly this kind of abuse. The law the HOA had so conveniently ignored, the Fair Housing Act. He read page after page, line after line, absorbing every clause relevant to disability rights and reasonable accommodations. The ramp was protected. His right to live independently was protected. The HOA was not only wrong, they were violating federal law in writing, repeatedly. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. They had picked a fight they could not win. Lucas began preparing a response they never expected, backed by the law they had failed to consider and the documentation they had foolishly provided. The battle for his ramp had only just begun. Lucas spent the next several days immersed in legal documentation. While most people would have felt overwhelmed by terms like reasonable accommodation, discriminatory practices, and protected classes, Lucas found himself absorbing the information with surprising clarity. He had navigated complex systems before: insurance appeals, medical reviews, rehabilitation requirements, but this felt different. This time, the fight wasn't just about access. It was about dignity. He printed out the relevant sections of the Fair Housing Act, highlighted passages, and organized them in a second binder labeled Legal Framework. Alongside it, he added copies of letters received from the HOA, including the ones containing exact phrasing that now stood out like beacons of liability. The words unauthorized structure, community uniformity, and voluntary removal appeared almost comical when juxtaposed with the language of federal law. He noted the date each violation was issued and the escalating fines. He recorded times the board refused to meet with him and logged the interaction with the receptionist who claimed the decision was final. Every detail mattered. Every oversight strengthened his case, but while Lucas prepared quietly, the HOA continued their pressure campaign, each action slipping unknowingly deeper into the trap they were building for themselves. The board posted a notice on the community bulletin board declaring a renewed focus on enforcement. It named no one directly but mentioned unapproved modifications visible from the street. Residents knew who it targeted. The whisper network moved quickly. Some residents shook their heads in disapproval. Others shrugged, unwilling to get involved. But everyone understood that Lucas had become the center of an HOA crusade. 3 days after the fourth letter, another envelope arrived. This one carried a more forceful tone, warning that if Lucas did not remove the non-compliant addition, the HOA would initiate a lien process against his property. The letter read like a threat, not a policy. The board claimed legal authority they didn't possess, wielding it like a weapon against someone they perceived as vulnerable, but Lucas was not vulnerable. Not anymore. What the board hadn't realized, and what Lucas had intentionally kept quiet, was that he wasn't handling this fight alone. That morning, he had sent every piece of documentation to a federal fair housing attorney whose firm specialized in disability discrimination cases. He had explained the situation thoroughly, attaching every letter, every photograph, every timestamped note. The attorney's reply had been swift and confident. The HOA had no ground to stand on. Throughout the week, the board members continued their routine patrols. They walked past Lucas's property, sometimes stopping to stare at the ramp as if willing it to disappear. Their body language betrayed something new: unease. Perhaps they sensed resistance. Perhaps they sensed eyes on them. Or perhaps they simply feared the growing murmurs among residents who began questioning the ethics of targeting a disabled homeowner. The HOA president, a stern man who had long held the belief that rules mattered more than people, called an internal meeting to discuss next steps. Though Lucas wasn't present, he heard about it through neighbors who worked nearby. The board debated fines, enforcement options, and potential legal avenues. But they operated under a fundamental misunderstanding. They believed Lucas had no recourse. What they didn't know was that their actions were already under federal review. The attorney Lucas had contacted forwarded everything to the regional office responsible for Fair Housing Act enforcement. The office took the case seriously. A disabled resident being forced to remove a medically necessary accessibility feature was not a bureaucratic issue, it was a federal violation. Lucas received confirmation that an investigation had been opened. The process would be deliberate and thorough, Meanwhile, Lucas continued to observe. He watched board members grow more irritated when he didn't respond to their letters. He watched their frustration rise when they realized intimidation wasn't working. He watched their composure falter as they left notes on his door that grew increasingly aggressive, as though trying to provoke a reaction, but Lucas never reacted. He simply documented everything. One morning, he rolled outside to find two board members debating measurements in front of his house again. They used their clipboards to hide the fact that they were taking photographs. He remained silent, watching them with a calm expression that unsettled them. They didn't understand the source of his confidence, and their confusion showed. Their attempts to force compliance intensified. They issued a final notice, bold and underlined, threatening that legal consequences would begin within days. They increased the fines again, now reaching absurd amounts. They cited bylaws incorrectly, manipulating language as if hoping he wouldn't notice, but Lucas noticed everything. By the end of the week, he had prepared a comprehensive file of all correspondence, every board action, and every moment of harassment. He combined both binders into one master folder, the kind of record attorneys build in major cases. And with each passing day, the case against the HOA grew more damning. Then came the moment that shifted the entire neighborhood's awareness. An official letter arrived not from the HOA, but from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Addressed directly to the HOA board, it notified them that a formal investigation into allegations of disability discrimination and unlawful housing practices was underway. The letter required them to preserve all documents, communications, and decisions related to Lucas's property. It warned them of potential violations and consequences, including fines, legal sanctions, and mandatory corrective action. Lucas didn't announce this victory. He didn't need to. The board received their copy publicly at the community office, and within hours, the news spread across Willow Crest like wildfire. Residents who once avoided interaction suddenly looked at Lucas with new eyes, not pity, but respect. Some approached him with quiet apologies. Others offered small gestures, helping with groceries, checking in, or simply acknowledging him with genuine warmth. But the most telling reaction came from the board members themselves. Their next inspection walk halted halfway down the sidewalk. Their pace slowed. Their posture stiffened. Their confidence evaporated. They whispered among themselves, glancing at Lucas's home with a mixture of fear and confusion. The ramp they tried to remove was no longer the issue, it was evidence, and Lucas was no longer the silent target they thought he was. He had become the center of a federal case they could not control. The HOA had made a grave mistake. And Lucas was only beginning to show them how costly that mistake would be. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting the morning after receiving the HUD notification. Its members gathered behind closed doors in the community clubhouse, their voices rising in anxious, muffled bursts that drifted into the surrounding courtyard. Though residents could not hear the words, they could sense the panic, the unraveling tension of a group realizing they had crossed far beyond the boundaries of their authority. Inside that room, the board pored over documents they barely understood. Pages of bylaws were scattered across the table, mixed with printouts of emails and copies of the letters they had sent Lucas. The president sat stiffly at the head of the table, face pale, jaw clenched, scanning the HUD letter again and again as if hoping to find a loophole. There was none. The board members shifted blame among themselves. Some insisted they had simply followed procedure. Others claimed they had been misled. A few tried to distance themselves entirely, arguing that they had only signed letters because they were told it was unanimous. But none of them could deny the reality. Their actions had attracted federal scrutiny, and the consequences could be severe. Meanwhile, Lucas watched from across the street through his living room window as board members hurried to and from the office carrying stacks of files. Their brisk walk betrayed their fear. It was a familiar sort of fear, the kind seen in people who believed themselves untouchable until the moment someone stronger, calmer, and better prepared pushed back. For the first time since moving in, Lucas felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. He hadn't won, not yet, but the tide had turned. The HOA no longer held power over him. Their letters, their threats, their fines, they were now evidence, not intimidation. Still, Lucas didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply continued documenting everything, knowing the investigation was only beginning. HUD had requested a complete timeline of events, and Lucas intended to provide the clearest picture possible. Days passed, and the atmosphere in Willow Crest shifted dramatically. The board, once bold in their enforcement rounds, now moved quietly, avoiding eye contact with residents. They stopped taking photographs of properties. They stopped posting notices. Their weekly compliance inspections, once conducted with self-assured authority, vanished entirely. the neighbors, too, began to adjust. Conversations that once paused when Lucas rolled by now continued freely. People greeted him more openly, some shyly offering words of support. The tension on the block slowly eased, replaced by a cautious curiosity as residents watched the HOA unravel. But the board's fear didn't translate into an apology, at least, not yet. Instead, they attempted subtle defensive maneuvers. They drafted new memos reminding residents of the HOA's commitment to fairness. They posted vague statements about ongoing misunderstandings and temporary administrative postponements. They even tried to portray themselves as victims of confusing legal requirements. Lucas saved every memo. One afternoon, 2 HUD investigators arrived in the neighborhood. They carried clipboards, wore formal attire, and approached Lucas's house with professional neutrality. Lucas welcomed them calmly, providing organized binders, dated photographs, and copies of every communication with the HOA. His home became the staging ground for truth, a quiet residence holding the power to dismantle months of targeted harassment. Across the street, board members watched anxiously from behind blinds and cracked doors as the investigators took notes and asked questions. The sight of federal officials walking through Willow Crest sent a ripple of unease through the community. The HOA had always believed itself above challenge. Now it stood exposed, vulnerable, and shaky. The investigators met with several neighbors, too. Some residents eagerly recounted the board's behavior, how often they saw members lurking near Lucas's home, taking photos, whispering with disapproval. Others spoke about the tone of HOA meetings, the way certain voices dominated decisions, and how some members bragged about enforcing standards without any real oversight. This testimony added layers to the case patterns of exclusion, selective enforcement, and discriminatory treatment. The more the investigators learned, the more serious their expressions became. That evening, the board issued a sudden announcement, a mandatory HOA meeting for all residents, scheduled for the following week. The flyer claimed the purpose was to clarify misunderstandings regarding community guidelines and discuss recent events affecting the neighborhood. Residents exchanged skeptical glances. The board didn't call meetings for misunderstandings. They called meetings when they were cornered. The night of the meeting arrived, and the clubhouse filled quickly. People filed in with the same restless anticipation found at the start of a courtroom session. Some hoped for answers. Others hoped for accountability. A few feared what might happen next. Lucas attended, arriving early to secure a spot near the back where he could observe the room clearly. His presence alone altered the energy. Residents whispered, board members stiffened, and the HOA president avoided looking in his direction. The meeting began with an awkward attempt at formality. The president thanked everyone for attending, cleared his throat multiple times, and then launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about community harmony and how important it was to support one another during challenging times. But his voice wavered when addressing the real issue. His words softened, became vague, then avoided the heart of the matter entirely. He never mentioned the Fair Housing Act. He never acknowledged discrimination. He never addressed the harassment. Instead, he attempted to reframe the ramp issue as a procedural oversight, a phrase that caused several residents to murmur in disbelief. It was the final insult, the refusal to admit wrongdoing even when caught. The room grew tense, heavy. Several residents exchanged glances, frustrated by the avoidance. Others looked confused, unsure why the board was dodging responsibility. It was then that Lucas took a slow breath, tightened his grip on his chair's push rim, and began rolling forward. Every eye followed him. Every whisper went silent. He reached the front of the room, binder in hand, and positioned himself before the board. Though he spoke calmly, the weight of his words was inescapable. He didn't speak long, but what he said pierced through the board's narrative. He explained the sequence of events. He explained the letters. He explained their refusal to meet with him. He explained the law they had violated directly, undeniably, repeatedly. He did not raise his voice. He did not insult. He did not dramatize. He simply stated the truth, and the truth was devastating. Residents who had been unsure now understood the full picture. Those who doubted now felt outrage. Those who supported the HOA shrank in their seats as reality settled harshly over them. The board members stood frozen, their expressions pale and slack. As Lucas finished his statement with quiet finality, the room erupted not with shouting, but with a collective judgment. The community had made up its mind. The HOA had not just made a mistake, it had become the enemy of the very residents it was meant to serve. In that moment, the board's authority cracked. And in the silence that followed, Lucas sensed the collapse had only just begun. The HOA board left that meeting rattled, shaken in a way they hadn't anticipated. Their authority once used casually, almost carelessly, had been pierced by something far stronger than their bylaws, collective awareness. The residents of Willow Crest filed out of the clubhouse that night with a new understanding of what had happened to Lucas Harding. The whispers that followed were different now. They weren't rumors. They were acknowledgments. Observations. Condemnations. People had finally seen the truth laid bare. The next morning, the HOA board attempted to compose themselves. They issued a community-wide email filled with vague language about pending reviews and ongoing discussions. Yet their tone, once authoritarian, now felt defensive, cornered. They tried to regain control by announcing temporary suspension of fines for all exterior modifications until further clarification of guidelines. It was a thinly veiled attempt to slow the bleeding, but the damage was already too deep. Residents who had stayed silent for months began speaking up. Some sent letters to the HOA demanding accountability. Others contacted HUD directly to share their own experiences. A few reached out to Lucas, offering testimonies or simply expressing regret for not stepping in sooner. Their messages were hesitant, careful, but genuine. Willow Crest was unlearning fear. In the days that followed, HUD intensified its investigation. The agency requested additional records, communications, and decision-making logs from the HOA. Board members were interviewed individually, their statements cross-checked against emails and the timeline Lucas meticulously documented. The investigators' presence was impossible to ignore. They walked through the neighborhood with quiet determination, asking questions, taking notes, and evaluating the environment that had enabled the harassment. Their calm professionalism only amplified the board's panic. Despite their attempts to appear cooperative, the cracks widened. The HOA president's carefully curated image of leadership deteriorated under scrutiny. Contradictions in his explanations, gaps in documentation, evasive responses all painted a clear picture. Several board members struggled to justify their signatures, claiming confusion or ignorance of federal law. But ignorance, HUD reminded them, was not a defense. Then came the official compliance conference. The board, visibly strained, gathered at a long table across from two HUD officials. The meeting was documented, structured like a negotiation, but with consequences looming over every word. Lucas was invited to attend not as a participant forced into confrontation, but as the wronged party whose rights were being defended. His presence alone changed the room's dynamic. No longer could the board speak about him as an issue or a problem. He was a person they wronged. When HUD presented its preliminary findings, silence washed over the room. The agency found strong evidence of discriminatory enforcement. The letters demanding removal of the ramp were deemed violations of federal law. The repeated refusal to acknowledge his disability, the intimidation tactics, the threats of liens, the selective enforcement, all of it amounted to unlawful harassment. The board's faces sank with each word. HUD laid out corrective measures. The HOA must immediately cease all actions against Lucas's ramp. The HOA must pay civil penalties for violating fair housing laws. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all board members. Revision of all HOA policies to comply with federal standards. Formal written apology issued to Lucas. Compensation for emotional and practical harm caused by the harassment. But the consequences did not stop there. HUD recommended the removal of several board members for misconduct, including the president. The room fell into stunned silence. The president's face drained of color. One board member shook her head as though she could not believe the situation had spiraled so far. Another muttered that she never wanted any part of this. Despite having signed every letter, they had built a fortress out of bylaws and arrogance. Now it was collapsing under the weight of federal law. Lucas accepted the corrective measures with a quiet nod. There was no triumph in his expression, only relief. Relief that his independence would no longer be threatened. Relief that he had been heard. Relief that the law had done what the HOA refused to do, respect his rights. The apology letter arrived a week later. It was long, formal, and clearly drafted by someone who understood the gravity of the situation. It acknowledged the violation of his rights, the harm caused by their actions, and their obligation to rectify the wrongs. It was the first time the HOA had addressed him with anything resembling respect. News of the ruling spread through Willow Crest like wildfire. The community was stunned. Some residents were angry at the board for endangering them all with reckless decisions. Others were embarrassed that their neighborhood had become the subject of a federal discrimination case, but many quietly, cautiously felt proud of Lucas, not because he had won, but because he had stood up, calmly and firmly, for something bigger than a ramp. He had reminded the neighborhood what fairness looked like, what dignity looked like, and what happens when someone refuses to be bullied into compliance. the ramp remained exactly where it belonged, solid, secure, and now symbolic. In time, new board elections were held. Residents, newly emboldened, voted out most of the previous members. They elected people with compassion, transparency, and a willingness to listen. A new era began, slow and careful, but undeniably different. Lucas continued living his life with the quiet independence he fought so hard to protect. Neighbors began waving more openly, stopping to chat, offering help not from pity but from genuine community spirit. The new HOA even asked for his input on accessibility policies to make sure no one else would ever face what he had faced. He accepted with a modest nod, offering suggestions that would ensure future residents, disabled or otherwise, would be treated with dignity. The battle had been long. The harassment had been bitter. The injustice had been real, but Lucas had done something extraordinary. He didn't just win. He changed Willow Crest Estates forever. A ramp built for access became a symbol of strength. A quiet resident became the catalyst for reform. And an HOA that thought it could override federal law learned that some fights cannot be won not with threats, not with fines, not with intimidation. Lucas had faced the HOA's biggest mistake. And he proved that when the law stands with you, even the most powerful board can fall.